president has phoned his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin over the Ukraine crisis. Gaine Chichikan joins us live now for more on that. Gaine, what did the two leaders discuss?
Well, the White House says President Obama called President Putin to discuss the situation in Ukraine. And of course, we have no way of knowing what exactly they said to each other. But the White House readout says President Obama underscored the rising human toll of the fighting and underscored the importance of President Putin seizing the opportunity presented by the ongoing discussions between Russia, France, Germany, and Ukraine to reach a peaceful resolution. And the White House also said if Russia continues its aggressive actions in Ukraine, including by sending troops, weapons, and financing to support the separatists, the costs for Russia will rise. Now, Russia denies doing all of the above, but the Russian president is currently negotiating a deal together with Ukraine, Germany, and France that is designed to put an end
The tension in Minsk was palpable. Vladimir Putin was greeted by the French and German leaders, but only after several awkward moments did he briefly shake hands with his Ukrainian counterpart. President Poroshenko insisted he stood his ground.
I can say that everything was difficult, and in fact, various unacceptable conditions were put to us, conditions of retreat, of surrender. We did not succumb to a single ultimatum and clearly defended our position.
The leaders of France, Germany, Russia and Ukraine sat for what turned out to be marathon negotiations. Only after 16 hours of intensive talks was a deal reached. It was a bleary-eyed Russian president who announced it. It wasn't the best night of my life, but the morning, in my view, was good. Because despite all of the difficulties in the process, we managed to agree on the main issues. Those main issues include a ceasefire, heavy weapons to be pulled out of the conflict zone, and constitutional reform in Ukraine to decentralize the rebel regions. But the question, though, is whether this will really satisfy the Kremlin, or has Vladimir Putin simply signed a deal which, like the one before it, will not last. This is what the Minsk agreement is meant to stop. But even as negotiations reached their climax, more people were killed. Ukrainian officials say more tanks and missile systems crossed from Russia. It's not
candles for those killed and pictures of the victims here on the Maidan Square in central Kiev. This is where the revolution in Ukraine started. And we asked people here what they think of the Minsk agreement. And we really got a mixed bag of emotions. There are people who simply think this is a bad deal for Ukraine, but there's also people who think that the deal simply won't hold. We spoke to one young man who's just signed up to join the fight against the pro-Russian rebels.
I don't believe in the agreement at all. We've signed agreements in the past, says 21-year-old Sergei, and all of them were breached. So I don't have any trust in any agreement with the Russians.
I think it was important to sign this agreement, yes. So we need to show for ourselves, for Europe, that we want to have a peace. We really want to have a peace.
I think we should try everything to show our humanity, this man says, and do everything to come to an agreement. But I just don't think this one will hold.
Even in light of the fact that this agreement was signed by the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Germans, and the French as well, there are still battalions that are fighting on the front line that are collecting money to continue fighting. And there's one that's even criticized the fact that this agreement was signed at all. So here in Kiev, in Ukraine, there is skepticism as to whether or not the ceasefire that was signed will actually bring peace to this country. For Plykin, CNN, Kiev.
Divided on whether to provide Kiev with lethal aid. Lithuania says Ukraine should be helped militarily. The Polish foreign minister said the country is ready to sell arms to Kiev, but the German defense minister says there are already far too many weapons on the ground. His position backed by the Austrian foreign minister, who thinks the conflict will only escalate if the U.S. goes ahead with arming Kiev. The British foreign secretary also doesn't think supplying arms...
So is Russia violating the Budapest Memorandum of 1994? Well, the first question is, what was that memorandum? The Budapest Memorandum said that Ukraine would give up all its nuclear weapons, and it had the third largest stockpile in the globe at that time, and it was getting assurances of security, of territorial integrity that were being assured by the United States, by Great Britain, and by Russia. By any measure, Russia has violated Ukraine's territorial integrity by going into Crimea, by having troops inside other parts of Ukraine. But at the same time, experts will also say that, well, the United States and Great Britain also gave guarantees there to help protect Ukraine. So in part, they have failed. Why are Germany and France taking the lead right now? Well, Germany and France both believe that a diplomatic solution is possible, based, it appears, roughly on the broad parameters of what was agreed in Minsk, the Minsk Protocol in September last year, that France and Germany both have economic interests in a long-term stable relationship with Russia. But the fundamental reason is that both Germany and France believe that this Minsk Protocol from September last year is salvageable, and they don't want to see a build-up of weapons and a greater instability of Europe. So what happens if there isn't a deal? Well, the bottom line is no deal potentially means an escalation of sanctions against President Putin and Russia and against the separatists that is backing. And if that doesn't work, there could well be a build-up of arms and weapons. The United States and potentially others supplying the Ukrainian government with what they call defensive weapons.
American foreign policy in the post-World War II era was, we did a pretty good job with that. It wasn't perfect, but the UN and the IMF and a whole host of treaties and rules and norms that were established really helped to stabilize the world in ways that it wouldn't otherwise be. Now, I also think that if we were just resorting to that and we didn't have a realistic view that there are bad people out there who are trying to do us harm, and we've got to have the strongest military in the world, and we occasionally have to twist the arms of countries that wouldn't do what we need them to do if it weren't for the various economic or diplomatic or in some cases military.
My fellow citizens of the world.
Crisis in Ukraine has set off a diplomatic scramble by the U.S. and its allies, including a visit to Kiev today by Secretary of State Kerry. With the ceasefire in tatters, eastern Ukraine is now a war zone. Fighters backed by Russia are on the offensive, and the U.S. may now arm Ukraine's defenders, raising fears of some sort of Cold War-style proxy war in Europe.
Obama said it's clear Russia is arming the rebels, despite Kremlin denials. So U.S. options must remain open if diplomacy and sanctions fail to move President Vladimir Putin.
And the possibility of lethal defensive weapons is one of those options that's being examined. But I have not made a decision about that yet. It's not based on the idea that Ukraine could defeat a Russian army that was determined. It is rather to see whether or not there are additional things we can do to help Ukraine bolster its defenses in the face of separatist aggression.
Chancellor Merkel warned at a weekend European security conference in Munich that adding more guns to the equation could dramatically escalate the war without causing Putin to change course. Today, she put it in other terms.
I've always said I don't see a military solution to this conflict, but we have to put all our efforts in bringing about a diplomatic solution. So if at a certain point in time one has to say that a success is not possible, then the United States and Europe have to sit together and try and explore further possibilities, what one can do.
Biggs here with Infowars.com. Now today what I'm going to do is show you footage of the blast from Sunday, except this will be a different angle and closer up. We'll get to that in just a minute. Now one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that Russia does have the capabilities in the area to use these tactical nuclear weapons. Obviously we weren't there. I don't know if this was a tactical nuclear weapon, but it was a very large explosion, and me being an artilleryman for a long time, I know what artillery looks like, and that did not look like an artillery blast of any kind that I've ever seen in my years and years in the military. But here's what we got. We've got an article from Newsweek that says Russia has threatened nuclear attack. And this coming from the Ukrainian defense minister. It says Kiev has received threats of nuclear retaliation from Russia through unofficial channels if it continues to fight pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. The Russian side has threatened on several occasions across unofficial channels that in the case of continued resistance, they are ready to use tactical nuclear weapons. And they have also said, or Putin has also come out and said, that if the U.S. sends weapons over into Ukraine, then he will be forced to use some kind of retaliation as well. Now, outside the U.S., both established and emerging nuclear powers increasingly see nuclear weapons as weapons that can be used in a controlled, limited, and strategically useful fashion. This is coming from Barry Watson, analyst with the Center of Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Russia has not only developed new, relatively low-yield tactical nukes, but also routinely wargame their use to stop both NATO and Chinese conventional forces should they overthrow Moscow's feeble post-Soviet military. Once again, that's not us. This is all the other people over there who are saying this. Coming from the Free Washington Beacon, Russia is moving tactical nuclear weapon systems into recently annexed Crimea, while the Obama administration is backing informal talks aimed at cutting U.S. tactical nuclear deployments in Europe. 3 senior House Republican leaders wrote to President Obama 2 weeks ago warning that Moscow will deploy nuclear missiles and bombers armed with long-range air-launched cruise missiles into occupied
captured
Ukraine.
the circling choppers on a cell phone.
Mom! What the hell?
The Army, in announcing a series of war games to be played here, said in a release, every precaution will be taken to mitigate the risks for the safety of all. The Army says these operations are going to continue through next Thursday in South Florida with no public notice or warning. So keep your ears open and your eyes up. You never know what might be coming your way.
Погибший крузак плывет. Музон главное не урубать. Бля, он специально это сделал.